In 1997, a juice company backed 1,000 truckloads of rotting orange peel into a Costa Rican nature reserve and dumped 12,000 tons of it onto bare ground. It smelled exactly as bad as it sounds. Within days, the site was covered in flies. A rival juice company sued. Their lawyers argued the reserve had been defiled, that a national park had been turned into an industrial dump. The Costa Rican Supreme Court agreed. The project was shut down, the site was written off as an embarrassment, and everyone involved moved on. Nobody went back to look for 16 years. When a Princeton researcher finally drove out to find the place in 2013, he could not locate it. He drove past the site twice. The ground that had been buried under rotting fruit was now covered in forest so dense that a scientist holding a map could not tell where the dump had been. To understand why anyone was dumping garbage in a nature reserve, you have to understand what that reserve actually was. Guanacaste, in the northwest of Costa Rica, is not rainforest. It is tropical dry forest, a habitat that loses its leaves in the dry season and burns easily. It is also one of the most destroyed ecosystems on Earth. Estimates suggest that less than 2% of the original Central American dry forest survives in anything close to intact condition. The reason is that dry forest is straightforward to convert. Rainforest fights back. Dry forest, once cleared and burned, turns into serviceable cattle pasture, and for centuries, that is exactly what happened across this coastline. By the 1980s, large parts of what would become the Área de Conservación Guanacaste were not forest at all. They were exhausted cattle ranches. The soil was compacted and depleted. The native trees were gone, and the pasture was dominated by introduced African grasses, giragua and similar species, which had been planted deliberately because cattle eat them. Those grasses turned out to be the trap. They grow tall, dry out, and burn readily. Fire sweeps the pasture, kills any tree seedling trying to establish, and leaves the grass roots intact to regrow. The grass then comes back thicker than before. It is a self-reinforcing loop, and it can hold land in a treeless state effectively forever. This is the part people underestimate about restoration. You cannot simply stop farming and wait. Land in that condition does not drift back toward forest on its own, because the thing occupying it is actively preventing forest from returning. Costa Rica had already tried the obvious approaches. Planting seedlings directly into pasture mostly failed, because the grass outcompeted them for water, and the next fire killed whatever survived. Fencing cattle out helped, but only slightly. The grass did not need cattle to hold its ground. Fire breaks and controlled burns reduced the damage in good years. However, a single dry season with a single ignition undid a decade of patient work. Hand clearing worked reliably, but hand clearing costs money per hectare, and Guanacaste was attempting restoration across tens of thousands of hectares on a conservation budget. The arithmetic never came close. The ecologists working in Guanacaste, among them Daniel Jansen and Winnie Hallwachs, who had spent decades on this landscape, needed a way to break the grass, something that would smother it long enough for tree seedlings to get established, across an area far too large to weed by hand, with a conservation budget that did not remotely cover it. The solution arrived from an unexpected direction. Del Oro, an orange juice producer, had built a processing plant near the park boundary. Juicing oranges generates an enormous amount of peel and pulp, and disposing of that waste legally is expensive. It has to go somewhere, and nobody wants it. So a trade was proposed. Del Oro would donate a section of forested land it owned along the park border, genuinely valuable habitat, and in exchange it would be permitted to dispose of its orange waste on degraded pasture inside the conservation area. Both sides got something real. The park gained protected forest at no cost. The company got rid of a waste stream, and if the ecologists were right, the waste would function as an enormous free application of organic mulch on ground that desperately needed it. In 1997, the trucks started running, roughly 1,000 loads, about 12,000 tons of orange peel and pulp, spread across a site of around 3 hectares, a patch smaller than most city parks. The immediate result was revolting. A layer of citrus waste half a meter thick, decomposing in tropical heat. The smell carried. Flies arrived in numbers people still describe decades later. To anyone driving past, it looked exactly like what the critics said it was. A company using a national park as a landfill. And optics matter in conservation more than the science does. A park exists because the public agrees it should. But a photograph of rotting industrial waste inside a protected area does not need a caption to do damage, and no ecologist's explanation about grass suppression was going to compete with the smell. Then the lawsuit landed. Ticofrut, a competing juice producer, took the case to court. The argument was that a private business was degrading protected public land for commercial convenience. Framed that way, it is not an unreasonable objection, and in 1998, Costa Rica's Supreme Court ruled against the arrangement. The program stopped. No more deliveries. The 3 hectares already covered were left exactly as they were, and the whole thing became a cautionary tale about conservationists being too clever. Nobody measured anything. The site was simply abandoned. 16 years passed. In 2013, Timothy Troyer, a graduate researcher at Princeton, heard about the old orange peel site and decided it was worth checking whether anything had happened there. He drove out to Guanacaste with directions and went looking. He could not find it. He drove past the location more than once. Eventually, the site had to be identified using a sign, because there was no visual difference between the dump site and surrounding forest, except that there was, and it was the opposite of what he expected. The treated ground was not scarred. It was the most vigorous vegetation in the area. Troyer and his colleagues, including Jonathan Choi, set up a proper comparison. On one side of a road, the 3 hectares that had received orange peel in 1997. On the other side, adjacent land, same soil, same rainfall, same history of cattle degradation, which had received nothing. A near-perfect natural experiment that had been sitting unexamined for 16 years. The findings were published in 2017, 20 years after the trucks ran. The orange peel plot held roughly 176% more above-ground biomass than the untreated control. Not 117%. Not double. Nearly 3 times the woody material standing on the same ground under the same sky. Tree species richness was higher. The canopy was thicker and closed over, where the control side was still patchy. Soil nutrients were substantially improved. More carbon, more nitrogen, more of the minerals that a forest needs, and that exhausted pasture does not have. The mechanism was not complicated, which is part of why it went unnoticed for so long. The half-meter layer of citrus waste physically smothered the African grass. Grass that cannot photosynthesize dies, and dead grass does not carry fire. That alone broke the burn cycle that had been holding the land treeless. Underneath, the peel decomposed. Tropical heat, tropical moisture, and a vast supply of sugar and organic matter created exactly the conditions decomposers want. Fungi and invertebrates moved in at volume. What had been compacted, depleted pasture soil turned into something with structure and nutrients. Then the seeds arrived. But the peel did not bring them. Birds and bats did. That distinction matters. Fruit-eating animals perch, and they deposit seeds where they perch. The vegetation that came up first created perches. Perches concentrated more seed rain. More seedlings meant more perches. The site pulled in tree species from surrounding forest fragments faster than open pasture ever could, because it had become a place worth landing in. Each of those steps is ordinary. Chained together over 16 years with nobody watching, they turned 3 hectares of degraded ranch land into closed canopy forest. There is one more detail worth sitting with. The control plot on the other side of the road was not neglected. It was inside the same protected area, under the same management, receiving the same legal protection from cattle and logging. It had 16 years of conservation applied to it. It just did not get the garbage. That is the uncomfortable comparison. Protection alone produced patchy scrub. Protection plus 1 afternoon of dumped waste produced forest. But the difference was not effort, or funding, or expertise. The ecologists managing both sides were the same people. The difference was 12,000 tons of something a factory was paying to get rid of. And the timing was luck. Had Troyer not gone looking in 2013, the site would have kept growing quietly, and the comparison would have gone unmeasured. However well the experiment worked, it very nearly produced no evidence at all. because the people best placed to check had been told by a court that the whole thing was a mistake. Now the part that complicates the story. The lawsuit was not frivolous. Strip out the specifics and the objection stands. A private company was granted permission to dispose of industrial waste inside a national park, and the arrangement benefited that company commercially. That is a precedent worth being nervous about. Approve it casually, and you have built a legal pathway for waste disposal on protected land, where most operators will not be supervised by career ecologists, and most waste will not be orange peel. The court had no results to weigh, because none existed yet. The evidence that would have justified the project did not arrive until 2017, 19 years after the ruling, and the finding is narrower than headlines suggest. This worked on tropical dry forest, in a specific climate, with a specific waste stream, on a specific type of degraded pasture. Orange peel is sugar, water, and organic matter, with no meaningful contaminant load. Most agricultural waste is not that clean. Nobody has shown this transfers. There is also an unresolved question underneath. What actually did the work? The nutrients, the physical smothering of the grass, or simply killing the fire cycle? On 3 hectares with no monitoring for 16 years, that cannot be separated cleanly. Each explanation predicts a different outcome somewhere else. However you rank them, the honest position is that nobody knows the weighting. Scale is the other unknown. 1/2 meter of decomposing citrus over 3 hectares is manageable. But spread the same depth over 3,000 hectares, and you are running an industrial operation with real risks. Nutrient runoff into streams, methane from anaerobic pockets, and a serious pest and disease question that a small trial never had to answer. The result is real, but it is one site, measured late, by researchers who nearly could not find it. That is worth celebrating, and it is not yet a method. The reason this still matters is the size of the waste stream. Global agricultural and food processing generates hundreds of millions of tons of organic residue a year. Peel, pulp, husk, pomace. Most of it is treated as a disposal cost, something to be trucked, buried, or burned. At the same time, hundreds of millions of hectares of former farmland sit degraded worldwide, held in exactly the condition Guanacaste's pastures were in. Compacted, depleted, dominated by grasses that burn. Guanacaste is the only place anyone has ever run these two problems into each other at scale and then measured the result 2 decades later. 1 free waste product, 1 patch of ruined ground, 3 hectares that nobody checked for 16 years. They threw 1,000 truckloads of orange peel into a forest that was not a forest yet, and got sued for it. 20 years later, the evidence was standing there, 3 times heavier than the land next door, and a scientist with a map drove straight past it twice. The waste was never the problem. It was in the wrong place.